Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this GM's tips video I'm going to be talking about props and handouts and whether they can be useful in your game. So what do I mean when I say props or handouts? Well, props or handouts are anything that you as a GM hand to the players, whether that be in the form of an electronic file if you're running an online game, whether it's a printed out piece of manuscript, a small image that you've taken off the internet, or any number of other potential handouts. But the important thing is that you give it to the players rather than yourself as a GM narrating it as part of the rest of the action. Now, there are a number of pros and cons to using handouts and props within your game. Now, one of the pros is that it gives the PCs something other than the Games Master to interact with, and their other players, obviously. Since a lot of the game world is handed down to the players and is described for them by the Games Master, by the storyteller, players tend to spend an awful lot of time in role-playing games sat around listening to the GM talk. Whilst this is obviously necessary for the game, it is nice to break that up every now and again, just for a little change of pace, to keep the players on their toes and to keep the ball rolling and keep their interest. Handing them a handout or a prop, whether it's a small figurine representing a statue or, as I said, some form of printed word, it gives them something that they can look at, they can read it themselves, they can examine it themselves, rather than just hearing you describe it. It gets them involved using other senses besides their sense of hearing to listen to you. It also allows them a great opportunity to more fully role-play out their discovery. I know personally that if I was to be, say, given a small statuette, let's say something like this small statue of the great old one Cthulhu that I just happen to have lying around, if I was handed this in a game and I was told that this represented a strange stone idol I found, my description of it to the other players would be very different than if they were just listening verbatim to a description supplied to all of us by the GM. And having all these different sorts of viewpoints, since everyone would describe it differently, adds a bit of verisimilitude and a bit of realism to a game, since after all, in the real world, people's perceptions colour their descriptions and how they relay things to other people. Whereas in a game you tend to often get things only from the GM's perspective, since they are the window on the world. If a player is able to keep the prop, or it's made available to them in the game, it can also act as a very good aide-memoire in future sessions. So a few months down the line, rather than me having to say, oh, do you remember that letter we stole from the Count's office? What did that say again? And the GM having to flick through their notes and relay the message. If I've got a copy of it in my character sheet folder or my folio or whatever you're using to store your records in, I can simply pull it out and I can say, remember this letter that we found in the Count's office, and I can actually show it to people and hand it to them, or I can read it out. This obviously does rely on the players being able to keep hold of the prop and not lose it over the course of time. So it's most often useful if you have some kind of folder for each character, or some kind of plastic wallet that they can store all of their useful and pertinent information, and probably their character sheets in. Props and handouts can also add a very visual element to a game, since no matter how good your GM is at describing things and portraying things through the other senses, there's often no replacement for actually being able to touch a physical object, to look at it yourself, to actually examine it almost as your character would, forming a link between the actions that the player is undertaking and the action that their character is undertaking. And this just I feel provides a useful bridge, allowing you to get more fully into your character's headspace. The prop or the handout, depending on what it is, can also almost act as an NPC in its own right. For instance, if you have an old diary, then the diary itself can tell you an awful lot about the person who wrote it and can almost portray everything about that person, even if you never actually meet the writer of the diary. And this can be very useful for characterization purposes. Of course, the main potential downside to props and handouts is dependent on what they are. They do require, or can require, a bit of time to create, and if you're very pushed as a GM, you may not have the time to create elaborate props, or you may not have the skills on Photoshop or the resources necessary to procure what you feel is an adequate prop. However, even if the prop is just a piece of paper with the letter printed out as a basic text file or written on a typewriter or handwritten or whatever you want to call it, you can get a lot of mileage out of it. And there's nothing wrong with the old trick of staining a piece of paper with a tea bag or crisping it up slightly with a cigarette lighter to make it look like an old parchment. You can get an awful lot of mileage out of that. The other potential disadvantage to props or handouts is that if players spend too long poring over them, it can slow down a game, breaking up the action and ruining any sense of momentum or climactic building of the plot that you've been able to accumulate. There's nothing that spoils the ratcheting up of tension, the building up of an atmosphere, then suddenly the entire game grinding to a halt while someone pores over and agonises over every word on a simple letter that you've handed. That can really bring a game session to a screeching halt. So, in conclusion, if you have the time and the ability to produce props or procure them or produce handouts, they can be an excellent and useful addition to a game, helping to build that sense of immersion and that sense of player buy-in to your game. However, they're only useful as long as you don't allow them to become a major distraction from the events that are occurring within the game session. If you find that this is the case and they are becoming a distraction or they're slowing your game down, either as a GM, spur the players along a bit, move them along a bit, or perhaps even give them the letter, but then rather than having them pour through it if you know that the player is likely to take a very long time or they're already taking a very long time, simply hand them the letter as a reminder for later on and then provide them a quick GM summary, and they can perhaps read the letter or look at the prop in between the game sessions at their leisure, without slowing down the pace of your actual session. So, those are my thoughts on using handouts and props in your RPG sessions. If you have any comments on this video, I hope you'll put them in the box down below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. And that if you've enjoyed it, you'll click on like and subscribe to the channel. We put out new videos every Wednesday. Until I see you next time, I look forward to reading what you write. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.